drinks this evening. First off, I've had the pleasure of meeting some of you before. A lot of you I haven't, so I suppose just to introduce myself. My name is Lande, and I'm here visiting from Ireland. I'm really delighted to be here because I've been meaning to come here for a long time, and various things have gotten in my way in the past. But finally I managed to make it here, and I've been asked to talk to you a little bit about debating developing nations. And for some reason I randomly got a picture of the Colosseum in Italy there, not implying anything about the Italians, but it was just basically the image that was there in the standard template, so I just left it there. So if I go on, what I want to talk about today is a couple of things. I want you to consider the range of countries that make up developing countries, and I'm going to try and narrow things down a little bit at times to probably the more pronounced cases of what are developing countries. But strictly speaking, if you get a debate which talks about developing countries, the first thing you need to be very clear on is what is the scope of what you're talking about. Because it could be anything from China through to Zimbabwe. And some people would even argue that you could include, we'll say, countries like Bulgaria, some former, we'll say, some former communist countries. I wouldn't really consider them to be, I suppose, developing nations at this stage. It's a member of the European Union, but there certainly are development issues in an awful lot of countries. So it's a very broad range of things. So I'm trying to, I suppose, mention the issue of scope now from the perspective of this presentation. But also I think it's incredibly important that the first thing you do whenever you get a developing nations debate or a debate about development is be clear yourself as to what is the scope which you're going to be talking about in the debate, what's implied by the motion and so forth. Because you don't want to have a debate where one side are talking about the Zimbabwe's and Malawis of the world, and the other side are talking about the Chinas and the Vietnams, which may have very different issues facing them. So the first thing is to be very clear that developing nations is a very broad thing. I'm going to try and get into detail in places in this presentation where I think it's particularly useful. Sometimes we just don't have time to get into an awful lot of detail. Because just like the scope, you could talk about debating developing nations for a day. There are so many different debates that fall under that. What I want to do is I want to go through some of the most common ones that I think come up. But for example, with things like examples, I may mention, for example, that I think, I'll mention later, that South Korea is a good example of a country which has done well from free trade. But I'm not really going to get into depth in that example. It's more I'm suggesting to you that it's one you might want to go away and look at, but I'll come back to that later. So I'll get into depth in some areas, but on most of them, I'm more so going to be just giving you a suggestion, like there's going to be work that you guys need to do, we'll say, before you go to a World Championships or European Championships. Perhaps spend break up a session with your teammate or whatever it may be. So for example, with the free trade one, I'm going to look at the Argentina example, he's going to look at the South Korea example and do a bit more reading. I think one of the things which, I'll come back to that in a second. No, okay, come back. One of the things I suppose which, it's one of those areas where some debates, so for example, human rights debates and so forth, are quite straightforward to argue for first principles. And there are first principles in developing nations debates. But I think international affairs in general probably requires a bit more work and a bit more preparation than social issues do, because they tend to be debates that benefit from facts. Because you're talking about such big things, people tend to, or such broad areas, people tend to argue a lot from analogy, so what has worked in other countries and so forth, more so than you might do in a debate, let's say, on a social issue like abortion or whatever it may be, where knowing facts wouldn't necessarily be as important. So I think it's something where my advice to you, and I mentioned this a little bit later, is unfortunately it's an area where there's a lot of work that you just have to do for yourselves. But I will do my best, I suppose, to give you tips on where to focus that work. Okay, moving on. Consider the characteristics. As much as I'm saying there's a broad there's a big difference between the countries that make up that, so it's a case of recognizing the massive differences between developing nations, and that the issues that affect them are completely different in a lot of cases. And it's also, quite obviously, it's a case of when you're debating the developing world, just remember there are big differences, and I will get into that later. It's a kind of slightly obvious statement. The big thing is, look at the social and historical factors that contribute to those problems. There are obviously exceptions, but it's a fact that the vast majority of developing nations were either colonies or in some way screwed over by their neighbours at some point, I think is the way of putting it. So there's a lot of having to factor in what are the impacts of history and how that has shaped their national psyches, in a way which is very different to an awful lot of developed nations. So even if it's a debate which is something which is, you could have that debate set in Britain, or you could have that debate set in Brazil. Think about the context as to how, even if it's a very standard debate and not something very specific, or you could say, well, that could just as easily be debated in the developed world. Think yourselves about how is it that that kind of history makes things different. This is very much me just setting context. And the one thing is this, and that's a tip which I'll give from the start, and I'll kind of drop these in from time to time. A very effective thing in any sort of developing nations debate is for op to claim the prop just aren't getting the nuances of what I'm saying here. So it's a case of, you can say, look, you're taking a very broad brush approach without recognizing that developing countries are different, or there are differences. Maybe what you're saying is true in the case of China, but we just don't think it's true in the vast majority of countries. So it's a case of look for those as opposition, look for where the other side, or as proposition, look for where the other side haven't recognized those nuances, and it's something that I think is quite important to do. Time frame. I think more so than any other type of debate, developing nations debates are focused very much on long-term outcomes. If you're talking about a debate, let's say, on deficits in the West, whether countries should cut their budget deficits or try and spend their way out of recession, a lot of the time, those debates focus on, or won on, the basis of what are going to be the short-term impacts of a country cutting its spending, or whatever it may be. Obviously, long-term factors play a part, but generally, in terms of developing world debates, the thing which I've noticed is judges are much more willing to accept that someone can say, look, we're just going to accept the short-term problems because it's about the long-term in terms of the developing world, because there have been problems for so long. So it's a case of, if I were to say the first step is recognize the nuances. The second step is you very much need to put yourself in a, what we're trying to achieve here is what are going to be the long-term impacts. And I think that's something very important. Short-term
is more important, or long-term?
Long-term, I think, is much more important. And where you're making arguments about short-term impacts, you very much want to focus on how this short-term impact is very important and underpinning, you'll say, something that's going to happen in the long run. Why it's not a case of that we're just going to see 3% GDP growth next year, but why that sort of change that brought about that is actually going to lead to long-term development. Because I think it's a case of recognizing the scale of the problems requires, I suppose, a longer view. Reading. This is something I kind of touched on earlier, but it's one of those areas where there isn't much of a substitute for knowing stuff. Sometimes you just have to do it. These debates are often argued comparatively. I've said that. Understanding the basics of the history are important. I think it's a case of, I think in particular, I suppose, most developing nations debates tend to be about an awful lot focused on Africa, Southeast Asia, and South America. So just knowing the absolute basics of those regions. So like, it's a case of, I would say, the most important things to understand about South America are, I think an awful lot of it comes down to the legacy of colonialism, what has been the impact on, let's say, for example, the native people of those regions and so forth. Because they feed into even an awful lot of the social issues in those countries as well, the kind of the conflicts over resources and rights and so forth, we'll say, between natives living in Brazil where they want to build a dam or whatever it may be. So I think it's important to just understand a little bit about what has happened in those countries that have made them who they are today. Africa, it's a very different problem because it's not so much been about big transplantations of population, but more so about the fact that they just arbitrarily drew up borders, which I suppose created minority issues in those countries which weren't there before. So it's a case of just knowing a little bit about, okay, hang on, we've got a debate, it's about Africa, I need to, like, just knowing a little bit about what countries are very divided. Why is it? Well, we know it's because Congo is a mess because Belgium were the colonial masters and made a mess of it because it was carved up in such and such a way. So, like, you don't need to know an awful lot, you don't need to know names or whatever, but just know the absolute basics, like, how is it that those kind of regions came about? Similar, I suppose, with Southeast Asia.
What's Southeast Asia?
Southeast Asia, I think there's a bit of a mix, because I suppose you have Thailand, which didn't necessarily have a kind of a colonial history. You have, I suppose, Britain had an influence there, France had an influence there. It's a bit more, less homogenous in terms of the problems than, let's say, Africa, I think, is primarily one of borders, the way they've been drawn is probably the biggest issue. South America, I think, is more so about kind of transplantations of populations and what impacts that had there. Southeast Asia, I think you see slightly different problems. So the problems, I think, in Vietnam are probably very different to Thailand, which just didn't have a big colonial presence.
Is there a definition for a developing country? I mean, what are the...
There's no accepted definition, and I think it's a case of the advice which I give you is that you need to look at the motion and just say, look, typically, what kind of countries are we talking about? And I think you need to be careful. Like, there's no hard and fast rule I can give you on this. Maybe it's something, if we want, we can go through a few motions later and just get, like, I can give you my opinion on where I think the line can be drawn on these. But my general advice would be is do it as wide as is practicable. So, like, it's a case of if someone's talking about like advancing women's rights, so we'll say tying aid to advancements in women's rights, I would probably say that that is certainly a debate which will have a very broad impact. Because I think whether you're talking about Somalia, or whether you're even, for example, talking about, let's say, well, okay, I don't want to dwell, I suppose, too much on countries, on just Muslim countries, but whether you're talking about Turkey, which is at a completely different stage of development. But also, arguably, even in countries in Southeast Asia, you have issues in terms of how empowered women are in those societies and so forth as well. So I think that's a debate where you'd say you could reasonably have that debate on a very broad scale in terms of the level of economic development, because it's a very common thing. On the other hand, there are some debates which are, I suppose, reasonable to narrow down a bit more, where you're talking about the absolute poorest of the poor. So, for example, if it's a debate about we'd only give emergency food aid in whatever circumstances, like, you're realistically not talking about Turkey in that case. So I think
the distinction between developing countries and failed states?
Again, it's a case that there's no established definition of what a failed state is. My view is, I suppose failed states I think is a whole other subcategory of debates to an extent. But I suppose failed states for me are ones which just don't have a functioning government. But once again, it's hard to give you there's no hard and fast rules to what the definition is. So what I'm saying is, I suppose it's hard to win these pure net principle. Two major types of debates I'm going to focus on. What I will say, I'm going to relate. We do an awful lot of debates about that this house would invade country X or intervene militarily in country X. I'm not going to cover them in this debate because I think there's a whole other session you could do on invasions. Some of the arguments I'll give you will be kind of applicable to those, but I'm going to try and stay away from them because I don't think they're real developing nations debates. I want to focus on other stuff. I think the two big things to focus on are, one is it's a case of like kind of economic, I suppose, and economic development in general. I'll leave it at that. And just kind of development of those countries' infrastructures and whatever it may be. And the other one, I suppose, is more around kind of social development, rights development, and governance development. They are the two things which will be the end goals in a lot of these debates. It's about how do you advance one or the other. And then you can tie in a mechanism often to any one of these. So it's a case of, if I were to go up a list of all the developing nations debates I've seen over the last couple of years, I would say that they are, there's probably 100 of them. But if I were to say, ultimately, the end goal is probably always one of about 7 or 8 different things, and the mechanism is probably one of about 7 or 8 different things, and the additional ones then are where it's being contextualized to a particular country or whatever. So the amount of things that you actually need to prepare for in advance, or are worth preparing for in advance, is actually quite small. Because if you think about it, what would be my argument if I need to argue about women's rights? What would be my arguments if I need to argue about democracy versus so for example, versus dictatorship? So that may cover off. So if you prepared your case on women's rights and you want on dictatorships or whatever it may be, that's something which maybe, or put some thought into it, and it's up to you as to how much preparation you want to put in. That's something that could be applicable to loads of debates that may come up. So I'm going to try and stick in those broad themes.